Hello, this episode is prompted by a discussion that I had yesterday with a person who challenged me in the sense that I do not know what I'm talking about fairies, and I should not be talking about fairies because I do not understand fairies. So I thought I would make this little recording to give some background. Where do I come from and what actually makes me somewhat qualified to approach the subject in discussion, in writing, and teaching about it. The person with whom I had this argument yesterday strongly subscribes to the theosophical view of fairies as insubstantial, spirit-like beings, powerless, with no understanding of good and bad, who look up to humans for guidance and aspiring to become human-like in some ways. So obviously I have different thoughts about this take on fairies, simply because I come from a very different background. And here is my background. First of all, I grew up in Romania. My grandmother was a folk medicine woman and a fairy seer. I'm using the term fairy seer because there is no linguistic equivalent, no exact term that would translate in English the name that the fairy seers are known by in Romania. And depending on the region, the terms are șaimancă or doftoraie. So doftoraie also applies to medicine woman. So what does a fairy seer do, basically? Well, fairy seers, and it's not only in Romania, but to my understanding in various other parts of the world, fairy seers receive their knowledge from fairies, knowledge pertaining to healing, knowledge pertaining to how to apply different charms and different magical cures or magical medical cures. Also tangible gifts given by fairy allies or fairy familiars to these people who work in partnership with fairies. Gifts such as medicinal herbs sometimes, or ingredients, again, to be used in magical medical remedies. In exchange, because there's a mutually beneficial relationship, so there has to be a form of exchange. In exchange, the fairy seers perform some form of service toward the fairies that they're in partnership with. So that's that. I grew up with my grandmother, therefore I gained exposure. I should say not just exposure, but I was immersed into these practices, into this lore and folklore. And this is a curious phenomena. Things that you grow up with, in a sense, they imprint, but in a sense, they are so natural and so part of your everyday reality that oftentimes you do not pay much attention to them. At least I wasn't. So I can read since I was about 3 years old. And by the age 5 or 6, I read plenty of fairy tales and stories for children featuring fairies, good fairies, bad fairies. So one day I had this argument with my grandmother, me explaining to her that her view of fairies is wrong. I know better because I read some books, and people writing books, they are bound to know what they're writing about. Therefore, that view of fairies, as presented in fairy tales, is the correct one and not what my grandmother was trying to teach me. So she tried to explain, didn't work out, stubborn, I know, what a shocker. But not long after I was running to her for help because I got myself into a predicament, and this happened more than once, into a predicament in situations that involved fairies. So I changed my mind and made peace with the fact that what's written in children's book and that infantilized view of fairies, or fairies who are there to reward good children for good behavior and punish or admonish children who are misbehaving, that is not necessarily real. I'm not denying that fairies and children cannot interact or have a relationship or a connection. That's a completely different story. I have thoughts about that too. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the overall depiction of fairies as being infantilized. This depiction being completely at odds with what my grandmother was explaining, presenting, exposing me to. Fairies as beings who are very powerful, who are like have their own agency. They live obviously in their world of their own and are in no way subservient to humans, and one has to be careful in how they interact with these fairy beings. So that is one layer of what I believe qualifies me to have a say in fairy matters. Later on, growing up, I become very interested into fairy lore and folklore, and see how practices from other parts of Europe parallel or mirror or are different from what I grew up with in Romania. And then my personal practice, because it revolves around fairies and fairy beings and relationships with fairy beings, also got shaped by what I read, what I learned, and what I experienced while traveling in different parts of Europe and different parts of the world. So mine is not just experiential approach, it's also scholarly, because I like to research lore and folklore, and I research to the best of my ability. So I'm keeping an open mind. I stand corrected when I understand it's impossible for someone to cover all the existing fairy lore and folklore in a given area of Europe, or in America, for example, North America, for example. So I stand corrected if I make affirmations based on what I read, based on what I learned that are not necessarily accurate. But in between this and be told that I have absolutely no qualifications to talk about fairies, it's a stretch. So thanks for listening, and let me know what you think.